Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Lily. Thank you to the Strands. Thank you to you too. I'm excited about this conversation. And this is the second event, Lily, in the series, is that right? So yeah, it's super thrilling to be here right as this great new series takes off. Long may it last. Let's dive in. Boundaries and Borders. In both of your books, latest books, I'm going to back up slightly so I can see you.
You're going to get dizzy. Let's do it like this. All right.
Oh, that's nice. Little half circle. I like it.
Yeah, exactly.
In both your latest books, your characters cross boundaries. They're able to live in two different worlds at once. In the case of Ways to Disappear, the main character, Emma, is a translator who lives in the English language and also in Portuguese, and she soon seems to abandon her own life to live in the life of her author. And in your latest series, the Shadowshaper series, your characters are able to, they live in the living world, but they're able to access the world of spirits. So I'd be curious to hear from both of you just how you came to write these books and what your own approach to the idea of boundaries and borders in them was.
Okay.
You start.
Well, you know, I kept coming across depictions of translators in different books and in different articles, and there was one in particular. Was an interview with Mario Vargas Llosa, and this was before he won the Nobel Prize. But of course, he was known to us because he had been translated by lots of different writers. And the woman who was interviewing him said it was about his latest novel, in which there's a translator who's sort of following somebody who is the bad girl, because the translator, the woman who's doing the interview, says is because she's so boring and she needs to follow the author because she doesn't have any personality of her own. And Vargas Llosa is like, yes, claro, that's what it's like with translators. They just have to hang on to the writers because they just have nothing happening for themselves. And I was like, so you said, you know, like the translators need the bad girls. And I drew the conclusion that this is in fact a fallacy because translators, we are the bad girls. And I think that's sort of where the book came from, because I have found that all the translators I know, the really good ones, hey, are the so when you have a student come to hear you and you're sort of like, oh my goodness, he's gonna know all the other side of the story. You know, there are the bad girls and boys of literature, I think, and so, you know, when you have you know, this depictions of translators as these people who are the ones who aren't taking the risks, when really translation is a beautiful risk. You're jumping from one way of thinking into another, and all the translators I know have lived all over the world and have taken great risks, not only as authors, but with their lives. And so I wanted to write a book that showed that translators are bad girls. And that was sort of where the book came from. I think it was this impulse to sort of write the book you can't find, and that was kind of where it came from.
I just want to be nerdy about translation now and not even answer your question, but I'm gonna try to do both at the same time, because I love what you said, and I think that's very true. And I always remember this quote. This guy Hussein Hadaway did a translation of The 1001 Nights, which was like finally someone, you know, a little bit more from that culture than most people who did it, which were very Orientalist versions of, you know, this really amazing old story or series of stories, and then turned it into kind of this like Western version of what they dreamt up the East to be. Anyway, Hussein Hadaway came along and did this incredible version of it, which my mom gave to me because my grandfather was obsessed with that book, but never had a really good translation in Cuba. And anyway, he says in his introduction, the translator has to stand astride two cultures. And it was such a beautiful image to me that really struck me, because that, first of all, is one that I identify with personally as a bicultural child. And second of all, just the concept of really standing astride these two worlds and becoming the bridge, right? Which is, to bring it back home, what Sierra and her friends are in a very real way, the bridge between the spirit world and our world right now. And the mechanism of that bridge in the shadow shaping world is art, because shadow shaping allows them to be the bridge between spirit and art, so they can actually put a spirit into a work of art, usually a mural. And that mural then comes to life and whoops bad guys' asses and does all the things that need to be done.
Which is what murals should always
Which
do.
is what murals should always do, you know, like the life-saving power of art, including whooping bad guys' asses, absolutely. So I was fascinated by that idea, and I think there's just such a rich history of those of us who don't fit easily into one box or another, whether that be with gender, race, culture, so many different things, exile. And I wanted to explore that with the quote-unquote real world and the spirit world.
Let's go back to bad girls and ass kicking, because I think that's what we're all interested in. Yeah, I'll just give a little bit more detail about the two books, because I guess we'll turn back to Emma, the bad girl translator in Ways to Disappear. She definitely takes risks. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that, but to tie into our theme though, if Emma is taking risks by not only living in two worlds but also kind of trying on her author's life for size almost in a way, she becomes involved with the author's very attractive young son, and kind of says, you know what, I don't know if I want to go to, is it Philly or Pittsburgh? I don't know if I want to go back to Pittsburgh. I might just stay here in, Brazil, because Brazil is pretty sweet. And she says it in a much more sophisticated and nuanced way than that, of course. But then, and in Shadowshaper, I mean, living between these two worlds allows Sierra and her friends to kind of communicate with the spirits and, as you say, kick a little ass, but it also exposes her. There's this thing that she does when she first starts to learn how to shadow shape, to access this world of the spirits, which you kind of change your vision, kind of soften your gaze a little bit, and so all of a sudden you can see all the spirits that are actually all around us at all times. But the instant that she does that, huge scary monsters come after her. So there's kind of this idea that, yes, there's power and badassery in being able to live in both worlds, but there's also real danger too. I'd be curious to just hear you expand upon the dangerous aspect, the powerful aspect a little bit.
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, it's a young adult fantasy novel, so there has to be dangerous shit that happens. It can't just be like, and then she came into her power and all was well in the kingdom. That is a short book and a bad and boring book. That's why, not for nothing, whenever I do panels about dystopias or these questions always comes up about like, how come utopias aren't cool? Because utopias are boring. Like, let's be honest, first of all. But also, we need conflict. So that's part of it, is literally just that. But it's also that belies a deeper truth, which is that when we come into our power, the world does challenge us on a deeper way, and then we have to step up. And it really does require that we step up on that deeper level so that we can get to the next place. So for Sierra, particularly in Shadow House Fall, it really is about her not being able to just sort of sit passively. And there's a trope, I think, especially in children's literature, of the kind of faceless, mediocre nobody that wanders through a very vibrant and beautiful world. And, whether it's Alice or sometimes, or Milo or Harry, like, they're cool characters and I can get down with them, all right, but there's also sort of a normalcy to them that I think is supposed to be in contrast to how amazing everything around them is. And I just really wanted to have a character that was also very vibrant and also just brought a lot to the picture and also just, really radical and insistent about what she wanted and believed in. That was really important to me. So Shadow House Fall really sees Sierra coming into her own and having to step up into a leadership role and really like take on the bad guys head on and define who she is in a different way.
Cool. Risk taking.
Well, I was thinking that translators in a certain way are shadow shapers also. We sort of shape the shadows, of what's the subtext, because I think what separates literature from anything else is subtext, right? If you pull out something, there's subway directions, although sometimes those can be fictional also, as mine were on my way here, because none of those trains actually exist today. But usually, but literature has a subtext. It has these shadows. And how do you, as a translator, translate the unsaid? How do you shape these shadows so that you don't turn them into anything more than a shadow? It has to be tone. It has to be the unsaid. And I think shaping those shadows is a superhero activity in that way. I certainly see the translators as the superheroes of literature. It may be my goal in life to say this many times all over the country. I came back from a festival in Michigan, and I was on a panel with this woman, and she was talking about, writing about the things that were happening in the United States, and somebody in the audience said, it seems in some way that you are sort of, translating our reality for us as a writer. And it's always interesting when people talk about, use the metaphor of translation for the self, translating the self, that, you're living in the United States, and so she's translating the United States for the United States in a way. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't really make any sense, And I also wonder, I've had this happen in a number of events where people say, we want to know what American is going to tell us what's happening right now in the United States. What American will be able to reveal ourselves to ourselves? And I was like, no, you actually need like a shadow shaper person to like see the mural somewhere else and then see the shadows and translate it from another country. We're not the first country that's had, interventions in our elections. We're not the first country who, half the country is divided. So it's been really interesting to see how in a moment where we could say, maybe we can connect with books that we wouldn't have related to as a country before, but now we can relate to them in a new way and revisit our exceptionalism as a culture.
Yes, please.
But instead, I feel like I keep encountering this sort of hyper-exceptionalism, that we've reached a point in which we are actually even less likely to see ourselves reflected in us because we become even more special in our dysfunction, as opposed to our exceptionalism is our dysfunction. Right. And that if we were more open to international literature, we would be at a deeper place than waiting for another American to reveal ourselves to ourselves.
Well, I think a lot about the idea of crisis, like as a literary truth, that we wrap all of our stories around some form of crisis, turning point, whatever it may be, and then as a political moment. And the idea, I love this notion of crisis as something that sort of ruptures all our dominant mythologies, right? Yeah. Which creates a vacuum, which then allows us to see all the different powers that be, so to speak, rushing into that vacuum to fill it. And absolutely November was a crisis in that very real sense, in that, suddenly lots of people's mythologies about who we are and what we represent were thrown up into the air and became up for grabs. And then we see different people making plays to try to take hold of that kind of vacancy and wrangle it back into place or whatever, or wrangle out something totally new, including absolutely the idea of American exceptionalism, which is huge on the left, which we saw over and over come out of Obama's mouth, for instance, again and again. And we absolutely haven't ruptured that very deranged myth that we really just hold tight to. But I think part of that, what you're saying, is exactly what it is, that people hold tight to the myths that we think, have saved us when they've really damned us.
Exactly. It's this strange inverse. So when I was reading, there's a series in the book that are sort of almost like a Greek chorus, where there are these radio reports from Radio Globo, which is Globo's sort of the large media company that sort of dominates the media conversation in Brazil. It's not quite like Fox because it's just it. Anyway, and so there's these radio reports that are from Globo, and they're sort of depictions of this woman in her 60s in the novel. She's a Brazilian writer. She has disappeared into a tree with a cigar in a suitcase, and there's a lot of conjecture about exactly why she disappeared and why she hasn't returned and what this means, because then some other writers start imitating her, and it becomes this sort of thing that other writers think that maybe they'll get more visibility if they also climb up into a tree, and so...
It does sound refreshing. I mean, I if you catch me up in a tree with a cigar, don't be surprised.
Well, you can be like, we're all looking for somewhere to escape. And so, on the radio, they're like, please, writers of Brazil, stay out of the tree. So it becomes like this ongoing, escalating situation. And she's depicted, talking about how much more beautiful she was when she was younger. A lot of the mystery about her revolves around her age, her body, these things. And it was so interesting when I was reading from it in the fall, in the lead up to the November election, saying like, our media would never, inaccurately portray women that way. We would never.
That was a thought you had?
No,
Really?
well, it was just, and so it's funny, I remember like the first reading I gave was like right after the election. I actually felt very somber to read these funny scenes because I was remembering how people are like, oh my goodness, the Brazilian media is so extreme and we've got it together. And I was like, I don't know. So it was interesting to see that the shift that people thought it was fun to read this book in Brazil and assume that these misrepresentations of women who are sort of reduced to being seen in their sort of physical bodies and more than anything else would be something that wouldn't happen in our own media. However,
However,
yeah.
while we're on politics,
Are we though?
I mean, like, as you said, like, we're gonna avoid the thing that can happen with every conversation since November, where that becomes the only thing we're gonna talk about. So let's get it out of our system a little bit.
Yeah, that was I'm done.
Oh yeah? Okay. Well, just the idea of, to kind of tie it back to our theme of boundaries and borders, I mean, anything with border in the title. In fact, Restless just threw an event with border in the title. I've been, my inbox, where I'm subscribed to all these literary newsletters, other publishers, just flooded with this idea of the border, and it seems like we're really obsessed with it in this moment, and for a good reason. We have a president who is determined to, I don't know, pretend like the rest of the world should be subordinate to us and also be prevented from entering the country, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm curious, because you two both seem very politically attuned, and you're participating in kind of this, you're crossing boundaries, you're crossing kind of these rules of how things are done. And I'm just curious, like, as a writer and a translator and even a musician, in this current moment of crisis, I love how you put that, does the artist have a responsibility to respond to our current crisis? And why or why not? And to what extent do you feel like, what percentage of your motivation in your writing is, I'm gonna address this stuff that's going on right now because this is messed up?
Idra.
I was looking.
I started the last one. I can start if you want.
I've always been a writer with a political imagination because I think, there's always been some sort of crisis that I was aware of, maybe because I grew up on the Rust Belt, which is kind of like a permanent state of crisis.
Right. Right.
And so, but something I was thinking about recently in this regard, was, what writers we could look at who are working in other countries. For example, would people say, what's going to happen to American education if there are more religious figures and Betsy DeVos and sort of, all these things happening? Well, look at the literature in Chile, where the country was divided. It's been 25 years since the Pinochet dictatorship, right? On the street where my husband grew up, and I've spent a lot of time living in the house, everyone knows who was a Pinochet supporter and who wasn't. People know whose children are descendants of Pinochet supporters. And I think that will happen in this country too. You will know. I think that enduring divide will lead to who marries and who dates, and it will lead to mistrust. And I think it is a divide that will affect the American imagination for a long time. And so to understand what that's going to look like in 25 years, we can't forecast that. But you know what? There is a country that has already had that happen for 25 years, and wouldn't it be revealing if we, read more Alejandro Zambra, or, like Nadia Velázquez? Like, I just think there are a lot of writers, the poems of Elvira Hernandez, who has an amazing poem about the varying relationships to the Chilean flag, and she has this great series about it. And I kept thinking about it when there was all this business happening with the monuments and who can go on their knee and who can't go on their knee, and its descent to form of patriotism. And although we have works that are about that are powerful, I also think it can be interesting to see how other countries who are questioning what patriotism means in a moment of crisis, it can be interesting to see what literature is happening there, And so that's, I'm more inclined to look at those poems and say, well, okay, well, let's look, how does this poem last? That was questioning, the flag as a symbol in a country that was also in the wake of a period of crisis.
But then, speaking of American exceptionalism, we would have to acknowledge that America is part of history and part of the rest of the world.
Right.
So
God forbid.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yes. No, absolutely. And it's interesting that people keep going back to sort of very trite, I'm just tired of hearing about 1984, and the whole problem
It was written in English.
It was written, exactly. And we've done better. Octavia Butler had created a much more imaginative, thoughtful, and very, very, very appliant to this exact moment dystopia, including the phrase "Make America Great Again," which appears in Parable of the Talent. So she was forecasting all this stuff, but we got to look at the white dude, from England that told us something, which I just think there's a lot more there, including things that have already happened. There's so much history to these types of events going on and how people have survived them. And that's really what we need to be having the conversation about is how do we survive? How do we get through this with our souls intact and our lives still present, right? That's the question we need to be asking. 1984 doesn't answer that question, not for nothing, because he dies at the end. Sorry, spoiler. But I just think that's an important note. That matters. And that comes back to your central question, and I love that you use the word responsibility, because that's a word that I've been thinking a lot about, and I think it really is important that we start to frame it in terms, we should always be framing it in terms of responsibility. Partially because as soon as we slip and don't, people come at us, including a lot of folks in the free speech movement before it got completely taken over by Nazis. There was a lot of arguments in the book world about whether or not we were telling people what to do by asking them not to put happy enslaved people in books. And to critique that became, oh, you're infringing on free speech. And, ultimately we're asking fellow writers to be more responsible, particularly if you're writing for children. And that's, I think, not too much to ask. I'm not trying to tell anybody what to do, but I'm saying, this is how I will respect you. And this is how I think, if we're going to put ourselves out into the world, this is a responsible and respectful way to do it, by not trying to continue the legacy of acting like slavery wasn't that bad. First and foremost, that seems like a basic thing, but suddenly it becomes about all this other stuff because what? Because it's an uncomfortable conversation. So yes, it's about being responsible. And then I think it just bears saying that as new and horrifying as this is also not new at all. This has a legacy in the entire history of exceptionalism and of everywhere that we've ever been. Every word out of his mouth has been said before. Sometimes it's been said in private rooms, and that's the only difference. But ultimately, the same people suffer. Maybe it is more now, absolutely, but we have to deal with that because if we keep acting like it's something that totally just came on the scene and is a total abstraction, in American culture, that's how we got into this mess in the first place, is by not confronting American exceptionalism right for what it is, white supremacy in our culture for what it is. I mean, the fact that people were kind of caught off guard about there being such entrenched white supremacy is the problem in itself, because a lot of us were ringing the alarm bells for decades. People always take, Shadow House Fall is implicitly about and explicitly about protest, street violence, state violence, kids of color taken to the streets. And people are always like, wow, it's so topical for right now. It's like you ripped it from the headlines. And I'm like, no. First of all, I wrote it 2 years ago. Second of all, police have always been killing unarmed black folks, as long as there have been police and unarmed black folks. Like literally, the dawn of this country is from that. So there's that. It's that, people brought the crisis, the moment of crisis, to the streets. Literally, I mean, I remember marching right outside here and laying down in the middle of intersections so that people who didn't have to deal with that crisis would know that it was a real one. And I think that is the job of the writer. That is our job as an artist in a time of crisis, is to bring that crisis home to folks who otherwise would just be going about their business.
Well said.
Shit. Got me riled up.
I'd be curious, Daniel, to hear a little bit more from your perspective of what you see as like the current trends in young people's literature that you see as positive ones, and what you think we might, like the general reading public, like people who are browsing the kids section of this bookstore, what are the unacknowledged assumptions that maybe we should start to interrogate a little bit?
Well, it is a really exciting moment. I mean, 3 years ago, a movement led by women of color writers, who are the most vulnerable people in the industry, really stood up and made a change. Just said, we're not taking it anymore. And collectively, we all raised our voices, and because of that, the bookshelf looks radically different and radically more honest than it did 3 years ago, and that's incredible. Of course, there's a long way to go, so I think that's important, but along with that change, what we've seen is much more nuanced portrayals of who we are and what the world is about, right? So there's multiple narratives in YA about police and state violence, whereas before there was a single narrative. That's amazing, you know, like, and they're all coming at it from different perspectives, and they're all in conversation. That's what we been needed, but we got it much more now, and that needs to continue. It can't be at the cost of other nuances, right? So we can't lose sight of intersectionalism as we move forward, and that's kind of sometimes the easiest thing to do, is be like, well, we're here now, we can stop working. We have to continue to lift up each
Obama
other.
won, racism is
Obama
over.
won, right, wait, the bookshelf is diverse, goodbye. You know, that's not how it works. It's still an incredibly transphobic industry. It's still an industry that erases huge swaths of people.
And it's just very heteronormative gender.
Heteronormative, absolutely. Like, all these layers are still at play, and we still need to be confronting them head on and dealing with them. So I think that's where we can kind of just miss stuff, is that there's a way that, look, we get tired, you know, people get burnt out. So it's not to say don't celebrate, right? It's to say the celebration is ongoing and the struggle is ongoing. And I think if we kind of like ease into that truth, then it stops being such a like jerky start and stop, like, oh, because we constantly get, you know, even a couple months into the We Need Diverse Books movement, we had people being like, all right, we did that, that's cool, you know, that was last year, great. You know, it's literally like, literally saying it to my face, like, this is a real conversation that gets had. So it's like, you can't sleep, but you can't never sleep because you got to rest, you know? So I think you got to write another book. And that's part of it too, is that you have the people that are supposed to be writing books having to be out there kind of defending ourselves and explaining, you know, why some shit isn't okay, which is time that we're not writing, you know? So we also need other people to jump in, which they've started to, which is dope, you know? Like, people in the publishing industry getting involved on different levels, and that's a huge part of this conversation, because the writers are the most vulnerable folks in the industry. We're the ones standing out in the front. We're the ones who don't have a steady paycheck. So, you know, but other folks are the ones who are like, oh, I got to protect my job. I'm like, you have a job. Like, okay, I write books. That's my job. So there's all these layers to it. But mainly it's like, jump in there and be a part of that conversation, because it's a beautiful one, and it's happening now in a way that is unfiltered and not about like PR or all the other kinds of bullshit that it used to be about.
And as far as international literature goes, and, you know, broadening our perspective to other literary traditions, other cultures, et cetera, what do you see as kind of positive trends that are happening, maybe unacknowledged negative trends, or what should we be watching out for? What can we do better?
Well, Elliot Weinberger has a great essay where he talks about how in moments of self-questioning is when the United States has been most open or eager to read other countries. So there was like a huge boom of interest in literature and translation during and after the Vietnam War. And I think that happened in the United States also with the Iraq War. But then we've just had, you know, and then there was Afghanistan. There's like, it's somehow just from Iraq War till now, there's sort of, it's continued to be a moment of self-questioning as a country. And so I think whenever there's this moment of reckoning, there is this sense that we're not in a moment of pride as a country for people who read literature.
We have to lose a war.
Right.
Basically.
So I think from there is this increased interest in what's being written elsewhere and how we can be in a global dialogue instead of just a more provincial domestic dialogue. But we also have, along with that, is the invade and translate phenomenon, where we invade a country and then out of guilt we translate that country, and then we invade someone else and then we translate the other.
Isn't it the least we can do, though?
Well, I think the problem is that there becomes this sort of moral imperative that this is the country you should read because what else can you do? And so the problem is that then I think I think a lot of writers now are kind of post-national writers, you know? Like, I've lived in a number of countries. I speak various, like, different languages, another one at home most of the time. So yes, I'm American. You know, I'll never recover from the Rust Belt, but, you know, I've lived in other countries, and I think in some way, you know, my perspective is probably more global than is American. And Milan Kundera had a great essay in the New Yorker saying that when you're always looking at someone in a national context and sort of pausing them in a national literature instead of sort of in an aesthetic trajectory, you know, and saying, like, you know, Thomas Bernhard probably has more in common with, you know, Horacio Castellanos Moya, or even I would say with Laszlo Kaznorkai, than you would say with just comparing him with, you know, other Austrian writers. because I think there's this like breathless long block of language that they do, and they see sort of the sentence almost as, you know, the length of the book. And so that actually creates more meaningful conversations. Like why prolong a sentence in a work of fiction for 200 pages? What do you get and what do you lose by that kind of sentence? And I think that looking at those connections can actually show more that then maybe you can take it back to the realities that they live. But I think we still have this tendency to always want to posit a writer in their national sense as opposed to maybe who they're in conversation with aesthetically. And I think that continues to be a problem. You know, and if you see books that are reviewed, they're often somebody who knows that language or is from that country, when maybe finding a writer who is actually more of like a similar aesthetic sensibility would be someone who would be a better match for that book.
I think we've come to really believe in the fiction of the line of the nation state, you know, and we really, like, that's become almost a religion that we just absolutely adhere to unquestioningly, even when in the back of our minds, I think we understand, like, you know, intellectually, oh yeah, that's a line that governments decided on and drew, but it's a fiction. Like, it's an actual science fiction, really, creation that people have brought to bear into this world and then kind of infringed on other people's sense of humanity. But we buy into it all the time because it's constantly shoved down our throat, and we're always reminded of it by whether it's, you know, in the newspaper, which nationalities get listed first in the list of deaths, or what have you. You know, it's constantly reinforced. But we accept it even if we at the same time kind of know. You know, if you ask someone, like, is there a reality to, like, national identity? I think a good number of people would be like, no, it's just whatever. But sure, even in that, I think we sort of enact the truth of it.
I did this event with 3 writers from Guatemala, and none of them lived in Guatemala. None of them had even lived in Guatemala, I think, in the last 5 or even 10 years. But they were all there because, yes, they were originally from Guatemala. Some of their work is set in Guatemala, but none of them lived there and had lived there in a long time. And they were saying that even the majority of the most prominent Guatemalan writers, none of them are actually living in Guatemala City or even in the country. The poets are there. And so it's interesting, the most prominent poets who identify Guatemalan are there, probably because they have maybe make less money, can't leave, but maybe with the froze, you can just get a one-way ticket to Berlin. I don't know. But it just happened that none of them lived there and hadn't in a while. And I thought that was actually maybe the most interesting thing, that like the most prominent voices in Guatemalan fiction were actually being written from outside the actual physical reality of the country. And I think that's true of a lot of Mexican writers right now too, you know, or even Argentinian writers, Samantha Schweblin, who's, you know, had an amazing book, Fever Dream, but she doesn't live in Argentina, hasn't lived there in some time.
Cubans too. There's a whole lot of us in exile writing, you know, about the Cuban experience, but not from Cuba. But sometimes then it becomes, and I think this is a good thing and a fascinating thing, is when you throw culture into the mix, then it becomes about this mix, again, this crisis really, of what does it mean to be a Cuban in another world, even if you weren't born in Cuba, or a Guatemalan who lived most of their lives there, but then has been gone for 10 or 15 years. You know, what is that study in contrast when you live in a cold place, you know, for the first time? And all those layers of depth, I think, come out. I mean, we can go all the way back to the Inferno, right, written from exile, and this fascinating story about hell and about what it meant to be torn away from the place that you love. I think there's a long history. When I was working on
this novel set in Brazil, I wasn't in Brazil, but I was translating these poems by Manuel de Barros, who's from the Pantanal, which is like the swamp wetlands of Brazil. And I would have to look up, you know, the flora and the fauna wouldn't exist here because we don't really have any of the plants or animals that are there. And I was like, so what is this blue fungus growing on the wall? And then all of a sudden I was writing, and I ended up putting a blue fungus in a scene that I was writing. So I think it's like when you're a translator, you are in your imagination sort of inhabiting the world of someone else. So I actually have never been to the Pantanal, but I spent like 4 years there in my mind. So did it impact my work? Yes. Like in some ways I sort of feel like I spent an extensive amount of time in the Brazilian wetlands. I've not been there, but with the language and the images of it, I would close my eyes and would just be trying to picture what was happening in these poems, and then it shaped my work. So I think there's a way that you can, you know, translation in some ways is a way of passing these borders without physically going there.
Mm-hmm. But that's also the process a fantasy writer goes through, right? Yeah. Because we always have, we take on what's called world building. When the reality is, it always just becomes like, oh, this is a fantasy writer's thing, right? You guys make up cool magic and that's what you do. I mean, yeah, we do. But, everybody world builds, right? Like every writer is responsible for the context of their piece. And by context, I mean, who do we leave in and who do we kick out of the world? You know, what are the details that matter to us? All of that is world building. And I find it's the writers that, whether they're contemporary literary writers, historical writers, whatever they may be, it's the ones that can really key into the depth of what a world means, both in terms of experience, like you're talking about, and also just in terms of the dynamic of it. Because I think another myth that we love and we adhere to very tightly, because I think it comforts us deep down inside, is the idea of the static location, as if there were places that don't move and never change. When of course they all do. They're very vibrant. This world is very dynamic. There is no place, no matter what sleepy town in Idaho or Havana or whatever you have, that everyone kind of creates this idea that they're just stuck in time. Everywhere is very alive with the politics of the moment around them, with the people that are there and their investment in it. We're in a constant state of change, as Octavia Butler taught us too. But you know, we want to believe in this place that never changes, and so we cling to that, and sometimes that slips out in our fiction, I think to the detriment of our fiction, because it feels false on some deep level. I think we know that, like, that's not really what's going on. Deep down there is change happening, and we want to see that reflected in the pages of books, whether they're in fucking Narnia or Idaho.
Well, it's funny because by the time I finished the book, and then it came out, and then the rights for it to be translated into Portuguese, and then it was translated into Portuguese, a bank that came up several times had been bought by somebody else. You know, and he's like, well, there's still a bank on that corner in Rio, but it's actually owned by another bank now. Like, there was a couple of things like that. And he's like, yeah, I know what story you're talking about. Gone. You know?
Right.
It was only like a matter of a couple of years.
Yes.
But those things change.
Shadowshaper,
Yeah.
as I was editing it, Brooklyn was gentrifying very quickly, and I was literally updating it over the course of editing it to keep track of what was happening. At one point, there's a coffee shop that I made up entirely on Bedford where all the characters go to hang out and talk trash and scare white people. And that shit was not real when I started writing, and it is there now. And I'm like,
Summoned it. You
apparently
summoned
I did. Now I go and hang out and do just that, you know.
You're like, I made you, Captain.
Right, I did this shit. I'm gonna walk in there one time and make a fuss. Like,
You're welcome.
Thank you. Good night.
Like, I ordered this coffee.
I'd like to go back to the idea of mold.
Mold?
Really the idea of how to capture an idea of something that you have never experienced yourself, or on the flip side of that, you know, Emma as a character struggles with how to translate like an experience that would make sense to people in Brazil or a certain place that wouldn't necessarily make sense to Americans. I think there's a phrase for it. It's in one of her definitions, I think. That are peppered throughout the book, where it's like the amount of compromise that you're willing to make in order to foster understanding. And Daniel, you've got this wonderful YouTube video, which I recommend everybody go watch, where Daniel explains why he does not italicize Spanish words in his books. I'm just going to say there are costume changes involved in the video.
It was necessary.
But, you know, I'd be curious to just hear from both of you, like, you know, your characters, like, clearly are adept at code switching between, you know, different kind of social registers. Emma as a character is adept at operating in two languages, but does that create kind of a split personality? Like, is there this struggle to create one whole self that becomes impossible the more different worlds you inhabit?
No, you want to roll. Go ahead. Don't let me stop you. You had a thought.
Well, so the scene that Nathan's referring to is in the book is where Emma's thinking about this sort of dilemma in translation, where whether you have the choice to domesticate. So you're talking about domestication and foreignization. So basically, when you have a choice, let's say you have something that would be, I'm just trying to think, like sourdough bread, right? And you're writing about a country where there isn't any sourdough bread. Do you keep the sourdough, or do you just call it bread, which means you would be domesticizing it to make it understandable to people there? Or do you foreignize it so that they know the smell and that sounds like the word sour of the place? So it's the question of this always, where do you fall on whether do you domesticize to make it closer to the world the reader knows, or do you foreignize and keep it closer to the world of the culture where it was written? And so I was interested how, as a translator, because you are in this limbo land, and you do it because you're an adventurous person who likes being a floating limbo land person. And so Emma in the novel is experiencing this choice of domestication or foreignization herself, and she's applying it to what she should do with the arrival of this man from Pittsburgh in Brazil. So when I was working on it, I was thinking about how the things that you know from your work life, or the things that you've come to consider as sort of dilemmas that you know professionally, how you then sort of incorporate those values into your actions in a personal life. Because I think we spend so much time working now. It's a lot, and you're checking your work emails, and you're thinking about your work friends become your weekend friends. And so how is it, I think the divide between who you are at work and who you are at home is like, it's just sort of gone, you know? And so what are the choices that you make professionally, and how do they then impact your personal relationships? So I think that was something that I was interested, you know, where do you stand? Do you think that you're sort of a liberal person on the weekend, but do you make conservative choices in your translation practice? Well, that wouldn't make any sense. So, I guess that was the dilemma I was kind of interested in exploring.
That's fascinating. On a different note, I'm dealing with that because I'm writing historical fantasy now. So it's a book set in the 1860s New York.
Are you foreignizing that?
No, I'm totally like, what's the other one?
Domesticizing.
Domesticizing it. Yeah, all the characters talking like Brooklyn slang. Why? Because that's what I'm most comfortable writing, and because it feels right to the narrative. And I think, you know, when we look back on historical fiction throughout the ages, that's kind of the choice that's been made and adhered to a lot that makes sense, you know, all the way back to Shakespeare. And I think there's something really powerful about the nuances of conversation and flow of the way that we talk in the poetic vernacular today, and bringing that to, decontextualizing that and kind of seeing it in another form. Having said that, then there are these beautiful turns of phrases that I always kind of mourn losing. Like when I watch Spanish movies and the subtitles are always trash, you know, like they just don't, right? Because there's such poetry to Spanish that there isn't to English. So when they say something like consúltalo con la almohada or whatever, which is consult with your pillow, which means sleep on it, they'll just make it sleep on it. And it's like, that's not the same thing as having a conversation with your pillow. You know, like that's so much deeper, but you just fucked it all up by, you know, anglicizing it into sleep on it. Nobody cares, right? It's just, but it's also said in such a, again, it's a vernacular. It's not like this high and mighty pronunciation. And so I think there's a beauty to that we sometimes lose when we domesticize them. So there's that. In terms of characters, I think it's really interesting because yes, there is a kind of divided mind that can come out of that. And it is dangerous in a way to have to code switch, but also what I really see more than that is just the fluidity with which so many of us have learned to do it and just make it a part of who we are, so that it really feels more like the world is broken and we are whole within it, you know, holding on to these multiple layers of language and stuff, which is why the italicized question is so important, because bilingual people don't shift in our brains when we're going back and forth between language. You know, it's a very fluid and beautiful kind of poetry that happens when different words will pop up. So the italicization just brings attention to it in a way that feels very false and kind of othering. There's a character in the Shadowshaper Cypher, Desmond Pocket, who's a Jamaican lawyer, and he, you know, speaks patois, like very deep patois, all the time, to the point that some characters have no idea what the fuck he's saying. But when he goes into lawyer talk, he slips easily into non-patois English. And the transition back and forth is completely natural to the point that he doesn't even recognize that he's doing it. Other people are like, wait, what's happening? You know, like it throws other people off. But I think there's a beauty to that speaks to the immigrant experience. It speaks to the experience of just being of color in a country that is insistent upon its whiteness. And then how to survive that means finding fluidity and wholeness within a world that insists on all these different divisions.
I think there's also something really fascinating that happens just when you use a word in another language and you move it. It doesn't always have the same meaning. Right. You know, and so if you translated the word, you put it back in English, it actually wouldn't mean the same thing. And I think that can also happen into other languages. So, for example, in Chile, whenever people will be like, "Oh, qué heavy," you know. But it doesn't, we wouldn't actually say heavy that way. You know, like if somebody tells you a story that's like really like gets you and you're like, oh, you'd be like, oh, "Está muy heavy," you know?
Right.
But like, we would never say that. It doesn't make any sense. And so they appropriate the word heavy to say something, make it in Spanish that we don't actually even make it say in English.
I might start saying that. That's pretty cool.
Actually, I do say it, but maybe that's because I speak Spanish.
Well, right. But
Right.
I think English speakers wouldn't just use
No, I think you're right. But it's interesting because that also pesadilla, right, is a nightmare.
Right.
Which is which is a heavy thing. And I've started saying it partially too because I'm really just trying to train myself out of the language of darkness as evil. Because particularly as a writer in the fantasy realm, we're still really stuck on that bullshit. And the anti-blackness that is inherent into this conversation we keep having of the black magic being evil and the dark side of the force and all that other bullshit, that really does get into you. And I think it's very deep how much, still in 2017, that is still a trope that we're like actively trying to detach from. House Fall is very much about holding on to the power of shadow and darkness as something that is really positive and uplifting. The whole series is about understanding the ghost story and the power of ancestry, which again is totally just criminalized and hated on in fantasy literature, as an empowering source of something great and inspiration that really can lift us up.
Let's pop it out to the audience.
Pop it out to the audience.
I don't know what that meant.
Brand new phrase.
Someone
Italicize
Someone
that.
should please domesticize that for me.
Yes, italicize and domesticize.
Any questions?
I feel like there's definitely a fucking question here. There's a lot of smart people in this room. All right. Student. Is he a student?
That's right.
Oh, make it good.
Thank you, Ray.
Yeah, I'll try my best.
Represent.
Hello, Professor.
Ray's here representing the news.
How important was traveling to your creative process? Because I went to France for the first time ever last summer, and I felt like I could be more creative. I was more willing to write poetry near the river. I don't really do that here in New York. I'm always in a rush to go. And how does meeting people from outside of America influence your characters? And do you want to capture them?
Yes. I opted with, Ray brought this up the first day of class, and I was like, yes, everywhere, because it's a senior fiction workshop. I was like, just get your passport in good shape and leave as soon as you graduate. Your writing will only blossom because you leave. I think the thing is that when you leave and you live in another language, it's an opportunity for reinvention, and Sarah Rule, who's a playwright, has this amazing short essay. She has this book called 100 Essays I Didn't Have Time to Write. And in one of them, she was saying that after she had her children, she'd be like, oh, I feel like my self is being annihilated by these new people. And then she's like, you know what? If that self was so fragile it could be annihilated, go ahead, annihilate it. It wasn't that sturdy of a self anyway, And I think that there's that travel, especially if you're staying and you're actually living there, not just passing through on a little moto or something, that you're sort of welcoming reinvention. You're welcoming that annihilation, and you're saying, well, what is it that's fragile in me that I could reinvent? And that, when you're open to annihilation, then I think you, as a writer, can maybe find some sort of more adventurous writing that you wouldn't do otherwise, And I think it's hard to annihilate the self and sort of reinvent if you're just next to the same river you've always known,
That was deep. I just want to say, I don't think I have anything to add. I just want to say, that was deep. Do you know Daniel Belm, the translator? Oh, okay. Because
maybe the only one I don't.
Maybe I got his name wrong. Anyway, he taught translation in the MFA program I did at Antioch, and we had a mandatory translation class, which was really cool. Yeah, and I recommend it for similar reasons. I think you have to annihilate your own concept of language too, and you get very stuck. Some of the great writers of our time wrote in their second language, and there's a reason for that, and it's powerful. I always think of in Spanish, right? You can't. You're not born passively. I can't even describe it. In English, you have to be born basically by someone else, right? You were birthed. Someone gave birth to you. I was born. In Spanish, nacer, you just actively do it yourself. You are just birthed, right? It's a whole other concept of what it means to come into this world. And it's really just a question of two totally different words, but you can't translate even what the difference is, right? It took me a paragraph to describe what I was talking about. That right there is so fascinating, and that is the kind of texture of depth of what you get out of a single word that you don't really have access to if you're stuck in this one monolingual lifestyle. That, not for nothing, but to take it back to American exceptionalism, the monolingualism is kind of the epicenter of American exceptionalism and why it's trash.
Yes.
Okay, you all mentioned novelists from Guatemala, Mexico, Argentina, and Cuba who left their countries to live and work in exile. Have you ever considered it, and under what circumstances would you?
Well, I did live. I lived in Chile for a number of years, and then I lived in Brazil, and then I came back here. And I go back. I live part of the year in Chile between the semesters, as many days as I can fit in. Ray knows. I was like, sorry guys, we're gonna miss the last 2 weeks of class, but we'll have individual meetings. I try to go for as long as I can. I'll bring this up. I'll be like, see, it's necessary for a writer's vision. I would like to leave the country again. It gets trickier though once you have like things like houses and jobs. It's like you can't really extract yourself that many times. It's hard to do.
That's true. Yeah, I will say that November was the first time I started considering it in any kind of serious way. But I don't. For me, like I'm a Cuban Jew, right? Like that's a double diaspora right there. Like so, I don't glamorize exile at all. So it doesn't appeal to me that much. Like I'm good in part because like in order to do the work, it just requires such an intense amount of investment of time and all these other things that is immediately, like when I think about living in another country, I'm thinking about all of the bullshit little logistics that it's gonna involve to like just settle in and everything else. Like, exactly, yeah. But I mean, I guess that shows how damn old I'm getting or something, because
But I think like right
yeah.
after college is an easy time, or like there's
Right. And it's one thing to be like, let me cut out for a little bit and come back. Although it wasn't really interesting reading about Ta-Nehisi's experience writing in Paris and how it echoed and didn't echo Baldwin's. I mean, I think there is a long history of kind of these amazing writers who've done that, like we were talking about before. It doesn't really appeal to me.
Stand or sitting? I'm standing already. I don't know if you remember, I interviewed you last year by the phone.
Yeah, you look familiar, but it's phone call, so I don't know.
I have such a beautiful voice.
Yes.
Anyway, so my question was, about these Latin American writers who, move out of their countries and live 20, 30 years abroad. Especially in the US, which is a very particular culture, and it's a very particular Latin culture as well. I was thinking first on Roberto Bolaño, was born in Chile, then went Mexico, then went Spain. Very universal.
He left Chile at a very young age.
Yes.
It's weird that he's still considered like graphic.
Exactly. You could not pin him a nationality. I was thinking also on Diaz, who has very particular identity. And there's like, I was thinking on, the universal Latin identity, a way to call it.
Right.
And if this doesn't sacrifice some sort of regional, particular identity that you belong to this random piece of land somewhere by becoming universal. So do you sacrifice something by acquiring something else?
I am always very skeptical of the term universal, mostly because I think it tends to be code for white, or for moving towards whiteness on some level, right? I don't think you were using it that way. I think in general, when the sort of people of the world say universal, it tends to kind of erase a lot of the things that make us who we are, the best things that make us who we are, which is the specificity of our culture. So while we're having the conversation about the fiction of the lines that divide us, we can't do it at the cost of holding up the power of the cultures that also enliven us, right? So it's not to say, because I think there's always a danger of sort of making things into a wash and be like, the whole, we're all one people bullshit, right? Like, we are and we're not at the same time. We're very much not. So it's like, kind of like, how do you find, I think your job as a writer really is to find those moments that you can connect to the human experience, but root it and ground it in the moments that are just very true to who you are and where you come from. And that's the job of the writer in exile. That's the job of the writer at home. That's just the job of the writer. Having said that, Galeano, his name just needs to be brought up because that's, I think, one of the great storytellers of our time in translation and in his native language, and someone who really went out into the world in exile and forced exile because of the dictatorship and his activism against it, but also used that moment to go and listen to people in a way that I think very few writers really achieve, in the sense that he really just shared the page with the voices of the people who he interacted with in a very humble way that was so beautiful. And he really marks kind of that exact intersection of history and mythology that we've been kind of skirting around this whole time, which is really, in a way, the place of translation.
And I think literature is about particulars, you know, and then otherwise you're just going to traffic in a bunch of platitudes, you know, and that what we're looking for is to connect to the universal through something so specific and visceral and evocative that we can see something we already knew but see it again, you know? But I think the thing that's interesting about living abroad is that you can write about different particulars. It's that you don't have to only write about the particulars of the place you left. Why can't you write about particulars of the place you are? So I translated this writer from 1920, the book came out in 1925, and his name was Emilio Lascano-Tegui. So right, he was born in Uruguay, then he lived in Buenos Aires, but he lived most of his life in Paris. And he was a friend of Apollo, and he was a friend of, he was a friend of Apollinaire, he was a friend of Picasso.
Wait a minute.
I was like,
that's amazing.
I warned Lily, I was like, I'm just back from Michigan. I can't tell for how well my brain will work. But yeah, so he's a friend of Apollinaire, he's a friend of Picasso. And he wrote this really incredibly evocative, vivid portrait of these towns outside of Paris. And the details are just insanely sensual, and he like falls in love with this goat, and there's this French little goat herd girl, and he's like just fascinated with the udders of this particular goat, Udder. And it's so specific, and it's such a very French book. But he's Uruguayan, you know, and it wasn't even published in Argentina because I think he's sort of like exploring some sort of coded, you know, attractions between men in the book and his alienation from his experience in the army, but it's all very subtle. So translating it, I was like, well, how do I convey what he's not saying? But the point is, it's full of gorgeous particulars, but it's not from the country he came from. And so it doesn't mean that because you leave a country that you have to write about the particulars of the place where you were born. You can write a book full of wonderful sensual particulars of wherever you are. You know, so I don't think it's an either or. I think that can be kind of like a false binary, which is you either write where you grew up or that you're just stuck in some sort of universal land of, you know, no particulars. I think that's actually, you can just write from the specific visceral worlds wherever you happen to be. Does that make sense?
And I think along with that, how does the place you are become a filter to how you view the place you were, right? I think a lot about Reinaldo Arenas, right? Who, I'm going to paraphrase the shit out of it, but talked about how in Cuba, when they beat you, you know, you have to whisper. But when you come to the United States, they still beat you, but now you can scream. And so his work in the United States was him screaming, and how powerful that is. But also just how his life was kind of turned by the movie Before Night Falls into such a terrible, horrible tragedy. We're just slow decline and just everything going wrong. When the man just had amazing sex all the time with whatever crossed his path, whether it was goats, trees, or sailors. And, you know, like just lived a very vibrant, beautiful life, like writing amazing poetry and being very much who he was in spite of dictatorship, and then in spite of American racism, and then in spite of dying of AIDS. And that's what his book is about. That's what Antes de Anochecer is about, is the vibrancy of his life in spite of all of these tragedies.
But he's sort of reduced to the terms
He's
of his
reduced
death.
to the terms of his death by, not for nothing, a white outsider who created this tragedy of, you know, just epic proportions. So there's such a strength, I think, just to him being able to look back at Cuba and appreciate all the great sex he had there and all the poetry he wrote and just that life, all those goats, that tree, just all that, you know, that's amazing. And that he couldn't write it there. He would write it, but he would hide it. And, all, you know, just the difference between writing it, hiding it under his clothes, having to burn it and destroy it, and then coming to the States and writing it and publishing it as a book and a memoir, it's a powerful story.
Let's have one more question. I saw a hand up back there.
I'm curious, how would you describe like your different brain or like the hat that you wear when you're from translating to writing? And Daniel, you know, do you feel like you have two different hats when you write for children or for adults or an essay or?
Sure.
That's a good looking hat right there.
I mean, I have many hats. This is my second favorite hat.
And I remember from the video, there's a lot of head wear.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yeah, it's more so with essays. There's a part of my brain that just, there's certain things that I think through that I really need to just say as analysis and fact. And if I try to put them into fiction, it gets clumsy. And if I'm in the middle of a book, sometimes I'll have to just stop and put it aside. That's my editor, so depending on how tight the deadline is. I'll put it aside and I'll just have to put it onto paper in the form of an essay. So it does feel like a very different hat. Fiction feels like my first language, and so that it takes me a lot longer to write like 3 pages of an essay than it does to write 3 pages of fiction, because I feel like I'm trying to wrestle the thought out. Sometimes I'll hit a certain point and it'll just come, but so I do think it's that. But when it comes to children, writing for children, writing for adults, there are important differences that I keep in mind, particularly now that I'm moving into the middle grade realm. But I also think what kind of unifies them is the most important thing, because if you lean in too much, the differences, what you get is condescending. And that's the one thing you can never be with children, because
So much condescension.
there's so much condescending shit. Their bullshit detectors are A100. You can't get bullshit past a kid, which is why kids are so awesome, right? Like that's also why they're great beta readers. Like if you want to really know if your book is good, give it to a 13-year-old. They will shred that shit. And that's great. Like that's what you need. You can't be around bullshitters. So it's really important. And I found that that's also naturally what I do when I teach. I teach the same material to literally 10-year-olds as I do to master's students. I just swear less, and that's about it. But like they are very capable of handling very complex and amazing concepts, and they will wrap their heads around it and spit it back out to you in a way that you had never thought of before. And they love it when you ask them to step up. And I think that's true of all of us, is that we want books that will demand us that we come up to their level, not books that will like sink to the lowest common denominator and hope that we kind of just like follow along, dumbly. And so that's kind of just what I try to do, is ask my readers to step up and do it in the best way possible and tell a great story.
I taught translation workshops translating poetry with kids in Washington Heights who are bilingual, and it was 4th graders. And I thought they were much better, some of them, than my undergrad translators, because I think the undergrads were so much more inhibited. And these kids were just writing from the heart, and they would just intuitively find the right word. And so, and I also think it was great for them to realize that they had the skill, that they were already bilingual, but they didn't realize that they could do something with it, with like a Pablo Neruda poem, or like a Rosario Castellanos poem. And then all of a sudden they were like, wow, like I can make this poem come alive and share it with somebody who wouldn't know it, And so but it was really interesting, because I found that their choices were more surprising and more spot on than the overdetermined, belabored choices that the undergrad thinks
Right.
is the thing that would be impressive to come up with.
Because they're not trying to get a job. Right? They're just doing it for fun. Right. Yeah.
All right, well, let's end on that note. Thank you, guys. That was wonderful. Big round of applause.